Hello viewers, and welcome to the final player card review video of the Shadows of Mirkwood cycle of adventure packs. So this is another installment of the LOTR LCG progression series brought to you by Cardboard of the Rings, the bi-weekly podcast about the Lord of the Rings the card game, which is a living card game by Fantasy Flight Games. This is Mitch, and joining me as always is Matthew.
Hello.
So let's go ahead and take a look at our final hero of this cycle.
So our final leadership hero of this cycle is Dáin Ironfoot, who has a threat cost of 11, 1 willpower, 2 attack strength, 3 defense strength, and 5 hit points. Dáin is a dwarf, and while he is ready, dwarf characters get +1 attack strength and +1 willpower. I mean, first and foremost, he is just a fantastic hero. He sort of is globally pumping up every dwarf that's on the table, whether it's under your control or your buddy's control. At this point in the game, not counting himself, there are 3 other dwarf heroes, and there are 6 dwarven allies. So Dáin was sort of our hint that we were about to get an explosion of dwarves coming up in the next deluxe expansion and cycle. And I think a lot of folks are really excited about him. If there's one drawback to me, and it's very minor, it's that Dáin has to be ready. So often he isn't doing much else except sort of just sitting on the table and pumping up other dwarves, unless, of course, you maybe put unexpected courage or something on him. What do you think of him, Mitch?
Well, I've got to say that hands down, Dáin Ironfoot is my favorite hero in the game thus far. Not only does he globally enhance all dwarves, so just like you said, if it's a 1-player game to a 4-player game, he's benefiting countless allies and other heroes. He makes a lot of my favorite other characters far stronger, so Gimli, whom I love, he's got +1 willpower, +1 attack strength. He also benefits a lot of allies, and it's not necessarily allies that you would include just 1 or 2 copies of in your deck, but they're absolute staples. So taking a look at all the different dwarf cards that he benefits, there are things like Veteran Axe Hand, which for 2 resources is now 3 attack strength. Erebor Hammersmith, which you're probably using to fetch Ancient Matham anyway, for 2 lore resources is 2 attack, 2 willpower. Miner of the Iron Hills is now 2 attack. So it seems as though it's just this whole new era of card strength. So any dwarf character from now on we kind of have to look at by itself and whether or not someone's going to be playing Dáin. Something that you touched on is he's definitely got that detrimental effect where he has to be ready. But if you're using unexpected courage, you can do a trick where you commit him to the quest, all dwarves lose his bonus, and then you use it to ready him again, and all dwarves are, again, benefiting from his ability. Another card that might be useful in just making sure that Dáin is ready under any circumstance is Common Cause, so one player can kind of sacrifice a less useful hero to make sure that Dane's, oh-so-important bonus is always in effect. And of course, if it comes down to it, at the end of the round, if you've got to do some really heavy-duty defending, he's already got 3 defense, he's got a massive pool of 5 hit points, so not only can he take undefended attacks and swing right back with, a relatively hardy swing of 2, but he's a great character to just load up with Dúnedain warnings and things like that. So sometimes dwarf decks, their attack strength is so formidable that even if the dwarves lose that 1 attack bonus, characters like Gimli can bring the pain without Dáin standing. So it's really hard for me to see anything wrong with running Dáin Ironfoot. Well, now that we've covered our new leadership hero, why don't we go ahead and cover our first new leadership attachment, which can make him even more of a defensive powerhouse. And that card is Dúnedain Signal, which for a cost of 1, has the Signal trait. You attach it to a hero, and the attached hero gains the Sentinel keyword. And just like every other Dúnedain attachment, its action, pay 1 resource from attached hero's pool to attach Dúnedain Signal to another hero. So I definitely like the Sentinel keyword, but this is certainly a card where if you run multiple copies, since you generally only have 1 defending character, 1 powerhouse defender, they're basically dead cards.
Yeah, I don't know if I have that much to say. It's sort of like the cache in that it's less useful, to me anyway, than the Dúnedain Mark or the Warning, or maybe even the Dúnedain Quest. But like you said, if your powerhouse defender doesn't have Sentinel, this could certainly be a nice addition.
Yeah, I guess if players aren't running cards like Aragorn that enters play with Signal, it can be useful. Maybe if you're running Denethor, whom you can slap a Burning Brand onto relatively easy, this allows him to defend against, any number of relatively wimpy enemies on the table, so Dúnedain Signal is alright. It's a little bit situational. There are times when it's probably going to come in handy, but overall, this is probably not the strongest addition to a leadership deck.
And so that brings us to the final leadership card for the Shadow of Mirkwood cycle, which is Dawn Take You All. It's an event which costs 2, and you play it after shadow cards have been dealt, but before any attacks have been resolved. Its combat action reads, each player may choose and discard one face-down shadow card from an enemy with which he is engaged. It's certainly an interesting effect, and to me this is sort of leadership channeling lore, or maybe even spirit. There's basically 2 uses that come to mind for me here. The first is that, of course, this is going to combo great if you've managed to have some sort of ability to peek at what's coming up from the encounter deck. So if you know a nasty shadow effect is coming, that's the one you select with Dawn Take You All. The other use, I think, is if you only know you have 2 attacks coming up, maybe even 3 attacks coming up. You can pay 2 to get rid of the 2 shadow effects, or the 2 shadow cards, so you don't have to deal with them. Or the third one, right, if your third attack is with someone who has Burning Brand or something, you choose the 2 that aren't with him. So, in a sense, I guess what I'm trying to say here is I think this card is maybe more useful if there are fewer shadow effects, in that there's only 2, you just clear them both out, basically paying 1 to get rid of each. Or again, if you have that third person with Burning Brand, you know that theirs is going to be nullified as well. Is that enough for me to include this in a deck with any regularity? I'm just not sure.
The thing about this is it definitely allows leadership another option other than Dúnedain Watcher to get rid of shadow effects. What's different about this one is it's before you know for certain that it's going to be nasty. So if you do have scrying effects, you know something awful is going to come up that's just going to ruin your situation in the game, that's great if you can take advantage of Dawn Take You All. But most of the time, I think you're probably going to be using this to invest a lot of resources to maybe discard a shadow card that didn't have any effect. I do like that it scales, so if there are 4 players in the game, all 4 of them have an enemy engaged with them. Each of them can pick 1 face-down shadow card to get rid of, but I think oftentimes it's probably going to be either, first of all, not getting rid of a shadow effect, or getting rid of a shadow effect that wasn't that big of a deal. But at the same time, sometimes it can save you from a really awful undefended attack, like, discard all attachments you control, or a dead hero, something like that. So it's very unpredictable. It could be an absolute home run, or it could be a complete whiff. And for a cost of 2...
Yeah, one thing I will add, and again, I know, the goal of the progression series is to think about the card at the time of its release. With that said, though, because I'll probably forget to say this once we get to Heirs of Numenor, is we've talked about this in our playthrough videos as well, is that FFG has gotten so much better at constructing encounter decks. Not only have they gotten smaller, they tend to only have 20 or 30-something cards in them now, as opposed to the 40 or 50 that some of the earlier quests have. But also, in some of the newer quests, almost all of them have shadow effects, and almost all of the shadow effects really stink. So I think that Dawn Take You All may be a card that's really worth thinking about in some of the more modern quests, but if we're talking about the Shadows of Mirkwood itself, not a lot of cards don't have shadows, or they're not that bad. So I think it's in sort of progression series environment not that great, but the more I think about it, I think it's actually a much more useful card in the modern environment.
Well, Heirs of Numenor aside, the next 2 tactics cards are going to take the Eagles deck that we're currently seeing and absolutely kick it into overdrive. And the first new tactics card is going to be the ally Eagles of the Misty Mountains, which for a cost of 4 has 2 willpower, 2 attack, 2 defense, and 4 hit points. It is both creature and Eagles of the Misty Mountains cannot have restricted attachments. Additionally, Eagles of the Misty Mountains gets +1 attack and +1 defense for each face-down attachment it has. And, of course, it has the response, after another Eagle character leaves play, you may attach that card face down to Eagles of the Misty Mountains. And I think that this ally is absolutely fantastic. So not only is it a powerful tactics ally that has 2 willpower, but it's just slightly more expensive than a lot of 2 willpower, 3 cost cards that we've seen. It has fantastic stats all around, and this definitely scales with the number of players. So the more Eagles you see on the board, the stronger Eagles of the Misty Mountains is going to be.
We finally get the card that explains why all of those Eagles get discarded from play, whether it's the Winged Guardian or the Vassal of the Windlord, or even maybe Descendant of Thorondor could be tucked under this Eagles of the Misty Mountains. I certainly think it's a good card. If there's a drawback, it's that its hit points don't get any greater as it gets increased defense and increased attack. Perhaps that doesn't matter if its defense strength is just so astronomical that that very little gets through. But there's so far in our progression series, it is a rare event indeed when we're paying for an ally that costs more than 3, with the exception of Gandalf. So the cost puts me off a little bit, especially since Descendant of Thorondor cost 4, Landreval cost 5, Vassal is only 1, and Winged Guardian's only 2, and those are probably the ones going under Eagles of the Misty Mountain more often, but it is quite a hefty investment of resources to get this guy to be potent at any sort of level. And unless you're running mono tactics or maybe mono tactics plus Radagast, it's really going to be somewhat difficult to get this ally pumped up.
Yeah, it certainly is very expensive, but just like you said, it feeds in perfectly to those Eagles leaving play. It does not work against Horn of Gondor or Prince Imrahil or Valiant Sacrifice because those characters are still leaving play. They're just also being tucked under this card. Really, I think it can become fantastically strong, relevant to attack or defense. It's just, you kind of have to ask yourself, is it insufficient to have like a 4 defense Winged Guardian? Is that not doing enough? Or if you've got a, Vassal of the Windlord that's already attacking for 3, maybe a time or 2, do you really need this Eagles of the Misty Mountains? Is it feasible that you can get it in play early enough in the game so that it ends up getting massively pumped up? So maybe it's going to work out, maybe it's going to be massively expensive, but it certainly has incredible potential.
Right. In my experience, and I've played Eagle decks quite a bit, I can't think of a time where this guy was ever massive. I certainly look forward to comments below that you guys can discuss your experience with him, because I'm sure someone has gotten him to work, especially in 3 or 4 player games, which I've not played very many of. But in my experience, this guy is just not worth the cost. He doesn't hit the table very often. Or the other Eagles have already left play because you needed them to defend or attack, and it's such a cool effect, but like so many of the cool effects in this game on allies, it's often hard to pull off.
Sure, and then really the only other concern I have left to mention is if you're putting all of your Eagle eggs in one basket with this character, it can be really dangerous if you've got one massive pumped up ally and then you pull a shadow effect that's pick and discard an ally. So
Right. So the final tactics card of the cycle is Support of the Eagles. It has a cost of 3, and it is a boon attachment. It must attach to a tactics hero, and its action reads, exhaust Support of the Eagles to choose an Eagle ally. Until the end of the phase, the attached hero adds that ally's attack or defense, and you must choose one, to its own. It's a nice attachment. It's too bad it doesn't have the eagle type, because then it could be search where the eagles are coming, which seems sort of weird to me that it doesn't. But, I've had this as well as Eagles of the Misty Mountain in some of my even more current decks, and I find myself resistant or hesitant to play this oftentimes, because 1, it's a hefty cost of 3. I'd probably rather have an ally on the table than this attachment, or I don't have other Eagles in play. So while I think Eagles of the Misty Mountain and Support of the Eagles are great in theory, in my experience, they've been duds, and they just sit in my hand and they don't get played. because they just don't have the other eagles to feed off of. Again, support of the eagles costs 3. For it to be worth anything, again, there's the cheap Vassal of the Windlord or Winged Guardian that certainly could be beneficial, but I almost always have something else in my hand that I would rather play than this. So, again, do I see its use? Yes. Have I played it and had it been useful? Absolutely. But that hefty cost of 3, there's usually something else I'm wanting to play.
So this card, when it first came out in that preview article and it was finally spoiled, it just absolutely blew me away. So thinking of a combo where you can make an existing powerful attacking or defending ally absolutely ungodly. For example, you can take Boromir, maybe combined with Dúnedain Cash. You can slap a Support of the Eagles or 3 on him, and so long as you've got a Vassal of the Windlord or a massively pumped up Eagles of the Misty Mountains in play, his attack strength can go from 3 to something more astronomical. He can ready repeatedly with his ability, and he can just absolutely wipe the board clean of enemies. In the very same vein, maybe you can have Aragorn, or a hero with Dúnedain Signal, get +4 defense, because you exhaust this attachment to pick a Winged Guardian to give it, 6 defense Aragorn, without having to worry about Dúnedain warnings. But the same problem with Eagles of the Misty Mountains applies here, where it is so expensive, it takes a lot of time to get this combo up and running. In our experience, at least, it seems like we generally put a lot of resource acceleration effects on the player that provides a little bit more control over the encounter deck, as opposed to bringing to bear a ton of defense or combat ability. So it seems like these are certainly powerful cards, but it just seems like it can be such absolute overkill, and saving up to pay for things like this can just be such an insurmountable task that it just gets ridiculous.
Yeah, certainly if we ever get any more Eagle allies, and so far we haven't seen any past the Shadows of Mirkwood cycle, this could warrant a second look. One, having cheaper Eagle allies, of course, would be nice, but just having more of them to draw from in your deck. At this point, we have 3 expensive Eagle allies, 2 at 4, 1 at 5, and 2 cheap ones, 1 at 1, 1 at 2. And so, again, for me, I love it. I've had it in so many decks, and I just sort of recently made the decision, you know what, this just isn't working at the end of the day. So, exciting, cool cards, and again, in reality, just, at least for me, I don't get the bang for the buck that I think I should.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't draw the Eagles, if you don't draw this in a timely fashion, it's not going to do you any good. But be that as it may, why don't we go ahead and take a look at our last spirit cards, the first of which is the ally West Road Traveler, which for a cost of 2 has 2 willpower, 0 attack, 0 defense, 1 hit point, and the Rohan trait. And response: after you play West Road Traveler, switch the active location with any other location in the staging area. So this is essentially an ally with a built-in lore Strider's Path tacked onto it.
Certainly, the 2 willpower for a cost of 2 is nice. Otherwise, I think the effect is somewhat niche. But it could be nice with a sneak attack if you draw a Brown Lands off the encounter deck or something. That nasty 5 threat, but only 1 progress token needs to be placed on it. And if you travel there, it's automatically explored. So if you get something like that would just decimate or cause you to not make quest progress, I think that could be a cool use of West Road Traveler. Otherwise, it is a Rohan ally, so as soon as that trait gets more developed, that could certainly be helpful, but certainly not my favorite ally.
Well, I've got to say this is actually probably one of my more favorite allies of Shadow of Mirkwood. Not only is it 2 for 2, I'm used to paying for things like Eomund, where it's 2 willpower for 3, or Rivendell Minstrel, where again, 2 willpower for 3. I really feel that this is a pretty potent effect. If you're able to travel to some easy location, like say Banks of the Anduin, which doesn't have any sort of nasty travel effect, maybe you can go ahead and put this into play and swap your active location to get around something like the Necromancer's Pass, so you suddenly don't have to discard cards at random from your hand, or whatever the nasty travel effect happens to be. So, granted, this Rohan ally is pretty fragile. If you end up readying it with Eomund or something, it doesn't have any real added utility outside of being a chump blocker, but if you're looking for a dirt cheap, capable, questing, willpower, spirit ally, there you go.
Right. You touched on the fragility of this ally. And I was going to say, if he's committed to the quest and that Necromancer's Reach comes out, well, bam, he's gone, and that's certainly no good. And again, as with every card, I think every card, for every card game ever made, the designers have an intention for why they design it. We may all think it's crap, but they had something in their head, some use for this. And I think, of course, there are uses, but I can't think of I was about to be super hyperbolic and say I can't think of a single time I'd want to switch the active location, which isn't true, but I just, I have never played that many games with this ally. Certainly my buddies aren't typically using this ally. So you've spoken so highly of this card, Mitch, that I look forward to seeing him do his thing in some of our upcoming progression series videos.
You certainly will, Tactics player.
All right. Which leads us to Astonishing Speed, which is our final spirit card in the cycle, weighing in at a cost of 3. It's an event. Its action reads, until the end of phase, all Rohan characters get +2. An expensive cost, I think, right off the bat. And provided I did my math right, there are currently 12 Rohan characters in the core set and the Shadows of Mirkwood cycle. So, and then they're all from different spheres. A lot of them don't have willpower, or at least, which of course this would give them some, but until this Rohan trait is really developed, again, this is a card, for me at least, that's going to be sitting in the binder.
I think this card is interesting. It's certainly a very expensive spirit card. If you need a massive quest push, this can certainly do it, so all of your Westroad Travelers, your Snowborn Scouts, Theodred, Eowyn, all of those Rohan characters committed to the quest can get a huge willpower boost. I think certainly this can be overkill sometimes, and I don't think there are too many Shadows of Mirkwood quests where you really need a tremendous amount of willpower. But this is a one-time effect. It can certainly boost you over the Karak or whatever active location you've got in your way. So I think this is good, but until we see a lot more development of Rohan, the dwarves are kind of hogging the spotlight right now.
Right. It certainly would be perhaps beneficial against that nasty, impassable bog with the 12 progress that it needs. That could just be a beast in the Dead Marshes. But yeah, by and large, I think I agree with you.
Really, the last thing I have to say about Astonishing Speed is there have been, and there always will be, moments during a quest where you probably don't want to commit a lot of willpower, so there are probably plenty of situations where a card like this is the exact last thing you want. Like, when you're in the first phase of conflict at the Karak, you're not trying to race into that second phase as quickly as you can. Or perhaps at the last quest phase of Journey Along the Anduin, where there are no, progress tokens required. If you draw this, it's essentially a dead card. So situationally, it's going to be fantastic. I can think of some scenarios coming up in the Dwaro-Delph cycle, but until we get there, I'm probably going to leave this out of my decks. So, taking a look at the last cards of our final sphere, Lore also receives an ally in the form of Mirkwood Runner, which for a cost of 3 has 1 willpower, 2 attack, 0 defense, and 2 hit points. It is a Sylvan and a Scout, and while Mirkwood Runner is attacking alone, the defending enemy does not count its defense strength. So the exciting thing about this guy is even though he's got a pretty low attack value, so long as you're able to soften up some sort of horrible enemy, he can potentially just deal that final blow by himself.
So we've sort of been talking about this sphere bleeding or melding with a lot of these other cards, and for me, this is Lore really channeling tactics. Which, is probably Lore's way of showcasing its knowledge of enemies' weakness or something, which is why he has this ability, which I think is good, especially if you can somehow boost his attack with an event card or something. But, he's not doing that much damage. He has to defend, attack by himself, so ranged characters or other characters aren't going to be able to help him too much. Hefty cost. I think it's, like so many cards, such a cool and interesting ability, but when you're only swinging for 2, it's certainly better than nothing. I'm just not sure that at a cost of 3, this is worth including.
The trick with this guy is it's a fantastic ability in theory, just like you said. So he can basically just assassinate nasty enemies. So if there's a hill troll with 2 hit points remaining, he can just swoop in, get past, I think, the 3 defense strength that card has, and just kill it. So he's basically attacking for 5. But there are going to be plenty of circumstances where enemies are going to have more than 2 hit points left, and he's, for a cost of 3, only going to be contributing to attack value. What's really a problem is we don't have a lot of effects where it's boosting the attack value of allies. So there's, 4 Gondor that gives him an additional 1 attack strength. There's certainly direct damage effects that can soften up enemies like Thalin, Descendant of Thorondor, Gandalf, Gondorian Spearman. Maybe you can do some really clever infighting tricks with this guy, but all in all, it's an awfully expensive assassin that's really only going to work situationally.
So that brings us to our very final lore card of the cycle, which is Rumor from the Earth. It's an event card with a cost of 0, and its action reads, look at the top card of the encounter deck, then you may pay 1 lore resource to return Rumor from the Earth to your hand. So obviously this is a scrying effect, giving you a sort of advanced knowledge of what's coming off the encounter deck. This certainly could combo with Dawn Take You All if it's used ahead of the shadow effect or shadow card stage, I suppose. But being able, having extra knowledge, being able to know what's coming off is always a good thing. But is it good enough to warrant including this card in your deck? There are probably better ways to accomplish this, I think, than maybe this card.
The trick with this one is it's a little bit resource intensive. So the natural comparison here is Corset's Hinnamarth Riversong. So instead of an ally for a cost of 1 that sits on the table and is very vulnerable to being killed by any number of damage effects, Rumor from the Earth, I think, is much safer in that it just sits in your hand. But each and every time you use it, so long as you want to be able to use it again, you've got to pay that 1 lore resource. So scrying effects like this definitely work best in a solo player environment. Maybe you want to predict the shadow card for the 1 enemy that you have on the table. Maybe it can work in conjunction with Hinnamarth Riversong in that you've got 1 predicting your staging, another predicting your enemy's shadow cards. But it's really kind of expensive, and as a player that generally plays 2-player games in this progression series, I'm not overly concerned, and I'd certainly rather save up some of those resources to pay for other things. So I like that it maybe frees up Denethor, but outside of a lot of situational uses in a more than 1-player game, I'm just not a big fan of this potentially very powerful lore event. Well, that brings us to the last card of this adventure pack and the final player card of the Shadows of Mirkwood cycle, which is the neutral event Shadow of the Past. It has a cost of 2 and has action. Move the top card of the encounter discard pile to the top of the encounter deck. So this is one of those cards where you really have to think about, what am I going to use this card for? So it immediately screams situational use. Maybe you can return some sort of relatively inoffensive encounter card to the top of the deck. Maybe if you're playing through the Dead Marshes and you ended up discarding Gollum as a shadow card, you can flip him back onto the top of the encounter deck. But overall, this is kind of a weak final entry in our assortment of player cards here.
Right. I was just about to say that this adventure pack starts with a bang and really ends with a whimper. It's certainly an interesting effect, and I think the Gollum use you just mentioned is certainly a good one in case he does escape you. But unless you're running a deck that's really focused on encounter deck cancellation or manipulation, I'm not really sure that this is worth including in any deck.
This certainly is a very tricky card. I mean, it's so specific to a certain situation, so you have to have it in your hand, you have to have the resources required to play it. there's got to be a good opportunity to use it, whether it's retrieving Golem, maybe whether it's retrieving a discarded Athelas or Forest Grove, or just putting some sort of easily explorable location back on top of the encounter deck if you, say, got a pair of Northern Trackers just destroying the staging area. So I don't think there's really too much else to say about this card. It probably would have been better to come out in our last scenario. But that brings us to the end of our final adventure pack of the Shadows of Mirkwood cycle. So Matthew, any overall thoughts about the strengths or weaknesses of some of these player cards in our new hero card?
You know, honestly, I think the only card I'm really all that fond of is Dáin Ironfoot. The leadership cards, you know, again, Tactics guy, love Tactics, love the Eagles. But in my experience with those two Tactics cards, they just don't pull their weight. I know you're loving the West Road Traveler. I will reserve judgment, I suppose, and wait to be impressed when you use him to great effect in your decks. But I think it's a very underwhelming pack, with the exception of the hero, who more than I think makes up for the other 9 cards.
I certainly think that leadership used up all of their card power in Dáin Ironfoot for this adventure pack, so Dúnedain Signal, Dawn Take You All are a little bit underwhelming. I mean, they certainly have their uses, but they're relatively situational. I certainly think Eagles of the Misty Mountains and Support of the Eagles are very strong cards, don't get me wrong there, but the amount of resource that has to go into getting them functional can be pretty daunting, at least in my personal experience. I do quite enjoy the 2 spirit cards we saw in this expansion. I think the only problem here is, at heart, I'm not really a Rohan player. Hopefully that'll be changing at some point in the future, but now they're kind of hit and miss. The lore cards are alright, but they don't really play to my personal playstyle, and our neutral card, I generally don't see any use for. So there are some cards in here that I absolutely love. Is this adventure pack worth buying for Dáin Ironfoot alone? In my opinion, yes, but your mileage might vary. Well, anything else to add, Matthew, before we go ahead and close this one down?
Just that I'm looking forward to actually returning to Mirkwood in the scenario.
Right. Well, with that said, be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel if you have not done so already. Be sure to let us know in the comments below what your own opinions are of these player cards. Next video, you can look forward to our actual playthrough of this final scenario of the Shadows of Mirkwood cycle. But until then, as always, thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Take care.